We do have a crisis in the nation, and I'm glad you're holding today's hearing. The topic of federal regulatory authorities over interstate hydrogen pipelines is really an important topic for us to be discussing. Over the past several years, the private sector has shown a growing interest in expanding the use of hydrogen as a fuel source. Hydrogen is the smallest, the lightest, and most abundant element in our universe. It also offers great promise as a source of low-carbon and carbon-free energy. The hydrogen we use is not found in isolation. It's commonly bound to other elements: methane, coal, water. Hydrogen must therefore be separated from these compounds. And for that reason, the places where we extract hydrogen will often be far from the places where we use hydrogen. That's why we need a safe, efficient, and cost-effective means, as you pointed out, to transport hydrogen. Now, hydrogen can be shipped in two ways. It can be chilled to a liquid and shipped by truck or rail or barge. Alternatively, it can be shipped as a compressed gas through pipelines. Most existing natural gas pipelines are equipped to ship methane blends, which can include up to 20% hydrogen. As interest in hydrogen expands, our existing interstate natural gas pipeline network may become the principal means that we use to ship hydrogen. At some point in the future, there may need to be a vast pipeline network that can ship higher blends of hydrogen or even exclusively hydrogen. And that brings us to the question before us today. What authority does the federal government currently have over hydrogen pipelines? And what does Congress need to know before we consider any next steps? Under current law, the Natural Gas Act provides the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, authority over natural gas pipelines. That includes pipelines that can ship up to 50% hydrogen. The Interstate Commerce Act provides the Commission authority over pipelines that ship hydrogen to be used as a fuel source. At this point, I'm not convinced that there is a so-called regulatory gap that Congress needs to fill. It's important to keep in mind that the hydrogen industry is still in its infancy. 20 years ago, many in Washington believed hydrogen would soon be a widely used fuel source. Despite millions of dollars in incentives and backing of the Bush administration, that never materialized. We must therefore be cautious and acknowledge that excessive regulation does more harm than good. So let's not kill the hydrogen industry while it is still in the cradle. We must also not take steps that may empower those looking to block new natural gas pipelines. Wyoming, West Virginia, many other states represented on this committee have been blessed with abundant natural gas resources. These natural gas resources have provided tens of millions of American families with an affordable and reliable source of energy. Yet today, our country's natural gas pipelines are under unprecedented attack. Well-funded environmental extremist activist groups are throwing the kitchen sink at every new project. The current majority of the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, wants to make it nearly impossible to upgrade pipelines or build new ones. I'm concerned that some of the Commission may seek to make the ability to ship higher blends of hydrogen a reason to impose new conditions on new or upgraded natural gas pipelines. If that happens, it'd be a disaster. Let's not give these activists or the Commission another weapon to use against natural gas pipelines. So I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and joining us. I especially want to thank Dr. Krutka from Wyoming, traveling from Laramie, Wyoming. I look forward to the testimony of all of you.
I'd also like to welcome our panelists and thank you all for making an effort to be here. Our first, I'll go through the difference. Our first is Mr. Andy Marsh. He's President and CEO of Plug. Andy, I'd like to thank you again for your recent trip to West Virginia to explore the potential to grow our state's hydrogen economy. Our state's excited to potentially partner with Plug and other hydrogen leaders. West Virginia is well positioned to quickly scale our hydrogen industry and attract a wide variety of manufacturers and other end users, bringing good-paying jobs and continuing to do our part to provide energy and products that our country needs. Next, we have Dr. Holly Krutka, which Senator Barrasso is very proud to have come from Wyoming, and I know how beautiful Wyoming is. Hard to leave this time of year, but we're glad you're here. She's director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. Then we have Mr. Chad Zamarin, Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategic Development at Williams. And then finally, we have Mr. Richard Powers, Partner and Head of the Energy Practice at Venable LLP. And I thank all of you for being here. Now to our witnesses' remarks, and we're going to start Mr. Marsh, with you.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, and thank you, Ranking Member Brasso, and all the other committee members. I'm here to testify for Plug Power. I've been the CEO for over 14 years, and we're spending billions of dollars building out the first green hydrogen network across the United States. Over 500 tons by 2025, 1,000 tons by 2028. We use our own electrolyzer technology developed in the U.S. for NASA and submarines. That technology it allows us to take renewable resources to create green hydrogen. Also, we're involved in liquefaction of hydrogen as well as transport of hydrogen. We probably know more about transporting hydrogen than anyone else in the world. That being said, when I look at the full ecosystem, I would like to highlight hydrogen is used today. Plug has shipped over 60,000 fuel cells, have built over 185 fueling stations, and 30% of the food in the U.S. actually touched a fuel cell during the COVID crisis to deliver food to homes. You know, the hydrogen economy is important for many reasons: decarbonization, social justice, but also for creating jobs. When you look at Plug, before COVID, Plug had about 900 employees. Today, we have over 3,000 employees. The Hydrogen Hub, which this committee was deeply involved in helping put in place, will help us continue to grow. And I do encourage folks to really continue to look at the hydrogen tax credit and an extension of the investment tax credit for fuel cells. It will help us to continue to grow this industry. You know, large scale, as the senator said, large scale hydrogen infrastructure is really in the early stages. And, you know, there's about 1,600 miles of dedicated hydrogen pipelines, and our numbers show about 2 million miles of natural gas pipelines. But you know, the potential to move through pipelines is really important. It costs about half as much as moving the same level of electricity, and that's a conservative number. You know, when I take a look at items also, it reduces the cost, and I live with these real costs. We mentioned compressed hydrogen. A kilogram of hydrogen costs about 80 cents to move 100 miles. A kilogram is equivalent to about 2 gallons of gasoline. If you want to move it through liquid, it's about 20 cents. And our estimates through pipelines, it's 5 cents per kilogram, dramatically changing the economics and really allows us to connect. And this was important, the hydrogen hubs, connect the end users. And Plug has many, many end users, from stationary products to material handling to on-road vehicles, with where you can generate low-cost energy in the wind belt and the sun belt. And pipelines is really the means to move that. So that being said, I'm not an expert in FERC. I've been in this hydrogen industry for 14 years, but I am an expert in understanding what things cost. And when we look at it, like many of the items that the two senators spoke about, rules for blending hydrogen are really important. And blending hydrogen is going on around the world, and I think it's important for the United States to participate also. It will help us keep domestic jobs for industry we created. I think it's important from a purity level, you know, and I think probably the most important item is the right-of-ways. So right-of-ways to be able to use present transmission line right-of-ways, natural gas pipelines right-of-way, really will help avoid unnecessary roadblocks. And of course, safety standards. And look, there's lots of people, not just us, who've been involved in safety in this industry for a long time. I would suggest that the committee encourage FERC to lean on the industry experts. And look, electrolyzers, I think, are critical to the long-term grid. They respond rapidly within seconds. They turn off rapidly. They allow you to use renewable energy that would go to waste. We're a true believer in the importance of storage of renewable hydrogen. And let me just finally say that I really appreciate the opportunity to present here today. Thank you again, Chairman Manchin, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. March. And before we turn to our next witness, I would like to go to
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Holly Krutko, who is the Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Krutko holds a doctorate in chemical engineering. She is a leading expert on advanced carbon capture technologies. She has led the School of Energy Resources since 2020, in March of 2020. The school conducts world-class research in carbon capture, in critical minerals, and hydrogen production and transportation. She holds 3 patents and has served in leadership positions at the National Coal Council and the Carbon Utilization Research Council. She worked all through a long-delayed family vacation to prepare for this hearing. We're delighted that she's here. That dedication is indicative of her commitment to her work, our state, and the University of Wyoming. Thanks again. Look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Crooker. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thanks for that kind introduction as well. I am Dr. Holly Krutko, Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. The school's mission is energy-driven economic development for the state. Wyoming exports over 90% of the energy we produce. Our economy and our way of life are dependent on the energy and extractive sectors. Wyoming is and plans to remain an all-of-the-above energy state. The school leads and supports research programs focused on our existing energy sector, including coal, oil and gas, including enhanced oil recovery, and economic geology, and more. We're also responsible for looking at new opportunities for Wyoming, such as carbon capture, use and storage, advanced nuclear, rare earth elements and critical minerals, and much more. We see hydrogen as an important component of the energy future and aim for Wyoming to be a hydrogen headwaters state. Today, I'll share some examples of Wyoming energy projects focused on hydrogen and also explain why I think Wyoming is an ideal location to demonstrate and commercialize some of these hydrogen technologies. Finally, I'll discuss the positive attributes of Wyoming natural gas and why it's critical that hydrogen regulations do not negatively impact natural gas production, transportation, and consumption. When it comes to standing up a hydrogen industry, Wyoming is standing on a strong foundation. In addition to being a leading energy producer, the state hosts a robust and expansive rail system, and that rail system could be used to transport clean ammonia. We also have an extensive natural gas pipeline network, and that offers the opportunity to transport clean hydrogen and blends of hydrogen and methane, which is probably the most likely opportunity in the near future. Wyoming industry partners are active in the research development needed to build out a hydrogen energy sector in Wyoming. For example, the school is working with both Williams and Tallgrass on applied research related commercial scale projects in Wyoming. The school's Center for Air Quality and Wyoming natural gas producers have long collaborated to reduce the methane footprint of our natural gas production. For example, Jonah Energy has achieved the gold standard in the United Nations-sponsored oil and gas methane partnership. Similarly, Pure West is working with Project Canary to verify 90% of its production in the state of Wyoming. In addition to these Wyoming-specific efforts, Wyoming joins a 4-state coalition that includes Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. The coalition's focused on competing for hydrogen hub funding under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which this committee was so instrumental in getting funded. And these hubs will provide a tremendous opportunity to understand how clean hydrogen industry will be built out and what sort of transportation is necessary. The school is also a member of the Clean Hydrogen Future Coalition, and the 35 members of that coalition really represent the full spectrum of the hydrogen ecosystem. The coalition is currently investigating various approaches for interstate pipeline regulation of hydrogen, but has not yet reached consensus conclusions. As I said, Wyoming natural gas producers are leaders in lowering the methane intensity of the natural gas they produce. Unfortunately, despite these efforts and the value of natural gas generally, it remains difficult and time-consuming to construct new natural gas infrastructure that the United States needs for both electricity and heating. If, for example, new natural gas infrastructure would also have to comply with new FERC-imposed mandates related to transporting blends of natural gas and hydrogen, I would worry that the infrastructure would never get built. Therefore, I and others in Wyoming are concerned about the imposition of new federal standards that could have unintended consequences on natural gas production and transportation, which are so important to Wyoming and the nation's energy security and economies. Governor Gordon recently testified before the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis about the critical role that natural gas will play in the evolving energy ecosystem. Similarly, the Wyoming Energy Authority filed comments that express Wyoming's concerns with pending FERC policies that may slow the build-out of necessary natural gas infrastructure. Wyoming, and thus the School of Energy Resources, is fully committed to becoming a leading hydrogen producer and exporter. I understand there's a question as to when and how to regulate this emerging industry. Between the research, hydrogen hubs, and coalition consensus building I've mentioned, much work is underway that can inform future regulations. We'll learn a tremendous amount in the next few years. Thanks for the opportunity to share Wyoming perspective on hydrogen and related federal regulatory authorities. And thanks so much for tackling such an important topic for Wyoming and the nation.
Thank you, Doctor. And now we're going to hear from Mr. Zimmerman. Zimmerman.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Chad Zamarin, and I am the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategic Development at the Williams Companies. I'm also, I was appointed by the Department of Secretary of Transportation to serve on the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee, which is an oversight committee for PHMSA. I am a descendant of Ukraine. My great-grandfather left in the midst of world wars to seek freedom and security here in the United States. And I can't tell you how proud that I am to work in an industry and for a company that every day is focused on protecting and advancing our energy security. At the Williams Companies, we are one of the largest energy infrastructure companies in the country. We move over a third of the nation's natural gas every day to heat our homes, cook our food, and increasingly power our electricity, and to help provide natural gas to our friends and allies around the world to help provide their energy security and also decarbonize and displace dirtier fuels. Our natural gas energy infrastructure is truly a national treasure. It is unique amongst the world. We can produce energy in places far from where it is consumed. We can move it across vast distances without losing it. We can store it underground without it depleting over time, and we can deliver it on demand when and where it's needed. It is truly a resource that we as a nation must protect. And I truly believe, and we at Williams believe, that the only way to scale hydrogen is to leverage this critical energy infrastructure. We have effectively solved the renewable equation with the natural gas value chain, the ability to produce, transport, store, and dispatch on demand. And we can do that, we believe, with hydrogen as that economy develops. Now, we're here to talk about the regulatory authority for hydrogen pipelines, storage, and potential exports. FERC is, as has been mentioned, our primary regulator for interstate natural gas pipelines. And it does seem like that's a likely venue for us to approach with respect to hydrogen. That said, we are concerned that we don't want to create a traffic jam before the car even gets out of the garage. The current FERC process has become an incredibly difficult process to facilitate the building of energy infrastructure. We've proposed in our written testimony some very simple changes that if the Congress were to act, we think could streamline the FERC permitting process and ensure that we can bring the infrastructure needed to not only continue delivering the critical natural gas here and around the world, but the hydrogen that we believe we can bring to market through our infrastructure. These changes are relatively simple, and Congress has the power to implement them. And we believe will unlock the hydrogen potential that our nation is seeking. We truly believe that we can build the energy economy of the future without destroying the energy security that we appreciate and enjoy here today. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Powers.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm here to offer my perspective as an energy lawyer for over 4 decades, practicing before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, state agencies, and courts of appeals, primarily on behalf of pipeline shippers and consumers in disputes with pipelines and in rulemakings under the Interstate Commerce Act and the Natural Gas Act. While the potential for hydrogen as an energy source has been around for a half a century or more, the current environment may have the most potential. I want initially to acknowledge my colleague William Bolgiano, who has published an extensive paper on the potential regulation of hydrogen pipelines that is cited in my testimony. My written comments may seem fairly technical, so let me address it in a more general sense, the issue we are facing with respect to transportation of hydrogen. As a preliminary matter, I believe FERC, and not the Surface Transportation Board, is the agency that should regulate hydrogen pipelines, because FERC has much, much more relevant experience in jurisdiction and other matters than the STB does. There are three options, as I see it, to regulate hydrogen pipelines at FERC. One, to amend the Natural Gas Act to cover hydrogen. Two, to treat them as covered under the Interstate Commerce Act. Or three, to enact an entirely new statute. FERC's ICA regime has been the backdrop of all non-gas pipeline development since 1906 and should be seriously considered as a shovel-ready option to provide clear and reasonable regulations for hydrogen pipelines. And to the extent hydrogen is transported in a natural gas stream, it would be covered by the Natural Gas Act. FERC oversees both the ICA and the NGA, and an integrated single-agency approach would be the most conducive, in my mind, for the continued development of the hydrogen industry. You've already talked about the various roles that FERC has. Natural gas are regulated under the NGA by FERC. Oil pipelines are regulated. Oil pipelines, which include refined products, and natural gas pipelines are regulated under the ICA. Other pipelines are regulated by the Surface Transportation Board. Some have expressed the view that hydrogen pipelines fall under the STB's authority. But as you will see in my testimony, I believe that it's more appropriate to apply FERC's jurisdiction under the ICA. Integrating our pipelines into our nation's energy policy and infrastructure is best served having these carriers under one FERC roof. First, I believe FERC already has jurisdiction over the hydrogen pipelines under the ICA. Second, the ICA is very flexible and adaptable regime. It applies traditional regulatory principles to pipelines carrying many different products. Under the ICA, FERC regulates pipelines carrying various grades of crude oil, refined petroleum products, and natural gas liquids. In contrast, the NGA is focused on one product, natural gas. FERC can apply its expertise to hydrogen pipelines under the ICA without changing its related regulations or deviating from its relevant precedent. Third, the ICA has a narrower scope than the NGA, which means this regime should not present obstacles to hydrogen pipeline infrastructure development. And more importantly, ICA regulation would not disrupt the operation of existing hydrogen pipeline and storage infrastructure that we all rely on to make fuel and fertilizer. When compared to the NGA, the ICA is much narrower in scope. It regulates transportation by pipeline. It does not need FERC. You do not need FERC approval to build pipelines or to begin service. The ICA requires that pipeline rates and practices be just and reasonable and non-discriminatory and clearly stated in their tariff, just like the NGA does. But more importantly, the ICA, unlike the NGA, is a common carrier regime, which mandates that infrastructure be available to all new shippers at all times. This could be especially important to potential producers, of which many are smaller and newer entities. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, let me thank all of you for your testimonies, and we appreciate very much you being here again. We'll now start our questioning, and I'd like to start. Mr. Zimmerman, I've heard that basically the components, the type of steel that we use for pipelines for gas is different than what we would need for hydrogen. So is there any way to recoat that? Is there any type of technology that we have, or does it have to be repurposed? Can we sleeve it, or does it just have to have a whole new composition of pipe?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Manchin. We truly believe that we can repurpose significant portions of our existing infrastructure to move hydrogen. I think that at blended levels, relatively low levels, even up to 20%, we believe most of our existing infrastructure can accommodate hydrogen. And if you think about our Transco pipeline system, it's the nation's largest natural gas pipeline system, moves over 20 BCF a day of natural gas. 10% of Transco is 2 BCF a day of hydrogen. That's more hydrogen than is produced around the world today. So we have an opportunity to scale up a hydrogen economy with the technology that exists today in our infrastructure. And as we do that, we will continue to expand our ability to increase the amount of hydrogen and ultimately, we believe, get to 100% hydrogen pipelines.
So you believe this technology is there now to repurpose the lines you already have?
At blends, we do believe that.
blends, you
And,
can,
and to get to 100% hydrogen, I think of it like the interstate highway system, where today we can't put electric vehicles across the country because we need to add,
Sure.
charging stations. I believe that we can modify the existing infrastructure without having to replace significant portions.
Mr. Marsh, you seem to be the leading proponent of, in real terms, in the commercial market today, and you found those markets for hydrogen. I'm really a big fan of hydrogen because I believe it's a good, it's the right direction for us to go. My biggest concern that I have right now is that we have not invested the money that we needed to invest in hydrogen. I mean, you look at basically how quickly we matured in 1 decade, wind and solar. Bottom line is we put about $100 billion to do it with tax credits, and about $10 billion as far as investment for new technology. We haven't done anything in tax credits for hydrogen. And so as we've been talking and going back and forth on everything, tell me what would be the best thing that we can do as Congress to put hydrogen on the map, to make sure it's going to be the leader, the transitory, does the heavy lifting, things of this sort.
Senator Manchin, not only do I think it can be put on the map for the United States, I think it can be put on the map to allow us to be exporting hydrogen. A production tax credit of $3 per kilogram for green hydrogen with a sliding scale for blue hydrogen will make us the leader around the world in renewable hydrogen production in a way that I would really like, because I spent a lot of time in Europe where it's a top-down, by using the tax code to encourage behavior.
In what form would you transport it overseas or whatever? How would you do it? Green ammonia?
I would transport green ammonia.
That's the best way.
Absolutely, from an energy density point of view, it is the right way to go.
Let me ask you another thing in making hydrogen. Okay, we know that once we have the hydrogen, it's used as carbonless, right? It's carbon-free.
Yes, it is.
But making it can be carbon productive. And we have to be able to, I've asked people, I said, well, if you have gas as a transition fuel from coal, and if gas is a transition fuel, then why would you go ahead and do the extra step of making hydrogen and you use as much exposure as far as for carbon by making the hydrogen? And then I was told, and I think maybe you and I talked about this, if you centralize that, if you centralize making your hydrogen where your gas production would be, so it won't be, it's not being made as green hydrogen with renewables. We're not in an area of the country that has enough renewables to do that. But then if you have sequestering it, you'd have all of it made at one place, and then the hydrogen would go in to the utilities to make the energy that we need. Is that what you're?
Absolutely, Senator. You know, we're a pure play green hydrogen player. That doesn't mean I don't believe there's other solutions. And blue hydrogen with carbon capture and sequestration
Can still be green.
Makes a great deal of sense to me. You know, geological storage, you know, we have to be serious about that.
Yeah.
Let me just
If I can just, if I may, and because we'll have more questions, I want to go to Dr. Kruka real quick. You come from Wyoming, which is like West Virginia, a very intensive energy state. Tell me how you all look at this as a transition fuel or a fuel for the future.
So thank you, Chairman Manchin. So we work on all of the above, and we really consider this as part of a portfolio, an opportunity to address heating and other opportunities for energy where you know you can't apply carbon capture and storage and other things like that.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Curtis, to follow up, I'm so glad you're here today. You have a doctorate in chemical engineering. It's my understanding that most natural gas pipelines, and we talked about them, are not equipped to ship blends of methane and hydrogen where the hydrogen component is greater than 20%. Could you please explain to all of us how a conventional natural gas pipeline differs from a pipeline which is capable of shipping blends with more than 20% hydrogen?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator Barrasso. So hydrogen being such a small molecule and corrosive can create cracks and attack imperfections that lead to metal embrittlement. So the solution would be, short of what was already discussed about potentially recoding existing networks, but for existing infrastructure, the solution would be to for natural gas, to have hydrogen, you would want either a different carbon steel, or you would want it to be thicker, or both.
So what would be the impact then in the cost of constructing, from conventional natural gas pipelines versus a pipeline that does all the things that you just described?
So the cost difference really depends on the size of the pipeline and the pressure. So often a number of 10% higher is used, but NIST did a great study that was published in 2018 that said that depending on the pipeline size and the pressure of the pipeline, that cost would range from 10% up to almost nearly 70%. So it's certainly non-trivial.
So, Mr. Powers, as someone who supports all forms of energy, including hydrogen, it's clear that we need and want private sector investment to drive hydrogen development. I understand private sector investors may want more certainty about regulation than they have at this early stage. At the same time, excessive regulation hurts industry development. So what can you talk about that balance of, and what kind of attributes of economic regulation would help the development of hydrogen infrastructure?
Yes, Senator, thank you for the question. I grew up in Williston, North Dakota. My family is in the energy business and has been for 50-some years. I have seen all forms of energy. I've worked on solar projects, hydro projects. I think the key to that is certainty and predictability in any regulatory regime, especially one which is going to regulate some kind of economic activity. I also believe that some kind of consumer protections are important where industries like pipeline industries have monopolistic tendencies, because you don't want to hinder the development of efficient markets and industries. And then finally, I think you have to be very conscious of the scope of your regulation, especially when you're starting on a new industry that has, what, 1,600 miles of pipeline? That's my response.
So Mr. Zamarin, then in terms of some certainty, Congress enacted the Natural Gas Act 1938 to meet a significant challenge. At the U.S. Supreme Court has put it, the purpose of the act is to encourage the orderly development of plentiful supplies of natural gas at reasonable prices. So multiple states are involved. They've come up with this. The Act's citing provisions helped to solve this problem, and our natural gas pipeline network became the envy of the world. But over the last 18 months in the Biden administration, the FERC has made it harder to get pipelines approved. So does Congress need to be careful in terms of any changes to the Natural Gas Act to ensure that change is not going to enable the Commission to make it even harder and put even additional burdens on pipeline construction?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yes, Congress does need to be cautious. I think that Congress can actually enhance the legislation to address the deficiencies that currently exist and are being attacked by certain parties to stop critical infrastructure. In my written testimony, I talk about establishing FERC's authority for issuing permits, about not allowing states to issue permits, but they should provide input. FERC should have the final answer, and we should be able to build infrastructure once it's gone through a very rigorous environmental review process. That should be the final answer, and we should be able to build that infrastructure. Today, it takes 4 to 5 years to build a pipeline that we can construct in under a year because of permitting. That absolutely needs to be addressed.
The cost. Ask him what it does to the cost.
What does that do to the cost, Senator Manchin is wondering?
The regulatory burden?
Yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, we used to have a rule of thumb that it would cost $1 million a mile to build a large diameter pipeline. It can now cost $8 to $20 million a mile.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And then, Dr. Crooker, finally, you talked about Wyoming being a hydrogen headwater state. You spoke about using natural gas as a source of producing hydrogen. What other energy sources are available to produce hydrogen in Wyoming?
Well, we have quite a bit available, so it might come as a surprise, but we are still interested in using coal to produce hydrogen. If it's going to work anywhere, it would be Wyoming. We obviously have low-cost coal, massive CO2 storage, and there's even opportunities to blend coal and biomass gasification to try to reach carbon-negative hydrogen. So, of course, I've already talked about natural gas. We have an advanced nuclear reactor being built in the state that is slated for electricity production, but we're focused on a nuclear industry that could also be used to create hydrogen. Then, of course, our renewable resources as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Powers, I've read your testimony but I want to be like very clear. Is it your position that that currently hydrogen could be regulated under existing authority under the ICA?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Would that apply, because I know there's a statute, or there's a definitional issue with respect to the fact that most hydrogen is currently derived from fossil fuel sources. Would it apply, in your view, to hydrogen from electrolysis as well? Or would it need to be blended for that, for that definition to still hold true?
Senator, thank you for the question. Let me back up.
Sure.
If you're talking about blending hydrogen into natural gas, then that would be covered by the Natural Gas
Right.
Act. If you're talking about hydrogen as its own source or transportation of, you go back to the 1906, they weren't thinking about renewable energies back then. So all the legislative history and so forth is sort of, geared
Right.
towards fossils. And clearly, if it's generated from fossil fuels, it's, and it generates energy, I think the FERC can regulate it under the ICA. On the other hand, FERC has, but not the courts yet, decided that they can regulate things that are not just from fossil fuels, but are energy producing and that can compete with other energy sources and that are transported on pipelines. But there is some, maybe a little bit of uncertainty, because even FERC has changed its mind on whether it's supposed to regulate ammonia or not. So I can say, yes, I believe it is, but there's not a lot of hard precedent.
So we could use some clarity that the ICA would be an appropriate way to regulate transport of hydrogen, especially if that hydrogen is purely generated from electrolysis.
Yes, Senator, I believe that is the case, because as you probably know, someone like me, we litigate a lot over what's covered and what's not
Sure.
covered, and what's jurisdictional and what's not. So a little more clarity would be, I think, perfect.
And talk to me some more about sort of common access to pipelines, what you brought up with respect to new sources and how we make sure that new uses and new sources have access to our transportation infrastructure.
Yes, Senator. The Natural Gas Act is more or less a contract carriage kind of provision or act. On the other hand, the ICA is a Common Carrier Act. And the way FERC has implemented it over the years is that all new shippers and all shippers should have access to that pipeline. And they require people to keep a certain amount of new capacity, generally 2%, available for new shippers. So I think, and it works fairly well. It maybe could be better. Some people say we should get more. But at the same time, at least there's a fair chance for somebody to get on that pipeline, and that's regulated by the Commission, FERC.
For Mr. Marsh or any of you who have expertise in this, what are the prospects for downstream deblending? So using existing pipelines for blended methane and hydrogen, and then pulling just the hydrogen out for end-use applications later.
So Senator, we do spend a lot of time on that issue. And it is the opinion of our technical office that the technology really does exist today. So that's not the challenge. It's how to do it cost effectively.
I was going to ask if
So
it's
that's really,
economical.
and I really don't have an answer to the cost effectiveness, but, it's actually a pretty simple schematic, but how to implement it, needs to be done and needs to be demonstrated at scale.
Okay.
I think it'd be perfect actually for the electrolyzer bill, which was part of the hydrogen hub activity, to demonstrate that type of technology.
Mr. Zamarin, talk to me a little bit more about the specifics of how you believe our existing infrastructure could be repurposed. What are some of the technologies and processes that you would use to be able to hold hydrogen in our existing pipeline infrastructure? And how do we avoid the sort of incredible leak issue that we've uncovered in recent years with respect to pure methane in existing infrastructure? How do we make sure we don't make those same mistakes the next time?
Yeah, thank you.
Especially given the size of the molecule.
Absolutely. And we are committed to decarbonizing and lowering the methane emissions of the existing natural gas infrastructure. And we are already working on hydrogen projects to demonstrate this ability. In New Jersey, we're going to produce hydrogen driven by solar power. We're going to put that into our Transco pipeline system and deliver that to consumers in New Jersey. We also are developing a project in Wyoming where we'd like to use wind power and natural gas production, show how we can complement those technologies and move hydrogen blended in our existing pipeline and serve the Pacific Northwest. We have pipelines in Wyoming that deliver to Washington, Oregon, and onto the doorstep of California. So I believe we can demonstrate that it can be done.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for this hearing. Thanks to the witnesses for being here as well. I'm pleased that we're actually talking about this issue because to me, this is talking not about how can we fit hydrogen into an existing permitting structure, but how do we fix the permitting structure that we have? Because whether it is a pipeline or whether it is an electricity transmission lines or whatever it is that we're moving, permitting's been our big issue. We have wind power coming out of Wyoming that's started permitting in 2007 that still can't get out with the Transwest. We have in Massachusetts, you have electricity lines that can go get hydropower from Canada, except they can't actually go get that. In natural gas, our problem is not a shortage of natural gas in the country. It's a shortage of pipelines to actually be able to move it. Our price issues right now with natural gas is a pipeline capacity issue more than anything else. So my first concern is I don't want us to put hydrogen and say, good, we have such a good structure right now with permitting natural gas pipelines, let's do it like that. Because I think it's a terrible idea to say, let's do it like that, because that's not working very well right now. So my questions are all around how we do the permitting and how we fix this. Mr. Zamarin, you actually tried to identify 5 areas, and I read through your notes on this. Establishing a lead agency to coordinate federal permitting. So you're not dealing with all kinds of different agencies that have different timelines, different rules for permitting. If you're going to do a pipeline, you got to know who's in charge, and everybody goes through that. That's a pretty reasonable thing. Allowing the lead agency to issue the permits, allow the other agencies to consult them in the process on it, so that you kind of know who's the boss of the whole project. It's very reasonable. Establishing a timeline for a yes or no decision. You just mentioned before, it takes 5 years to be able to get a permit now, to be able to do a natural gas pipeline. We can't have that. People aren't going to invest long-term in that. So having a decision time period, it seems reasonable. We had the Canadian leadership in here not long ago talking about mining and energy production in Canada. The timelines that they have set here seem to be endless with litigation. Theirs are very fixed, and so they're more predictable in the process. Establishing in statute that critical infrastructure projects are deemed in the public interest. I think it's very reasonable. We need more energy. Lots of areas around the center part of the country right now are dealing with electricity availability right now because we don't have enough energy, actually. And so we've got to be able to have that. And then revising the standard for judicial review to ensure infrastructure certificates and permits are approved unless the record lacks credible evidence to support a permit. Those are pretty reasonable changes on that. Is there anything that you want to add to that or highlight on that?
Thank you, Senator. I would just like to say that we are not trying to eliminate, sensible regulations. We are not trying to lower the environmental threshold for us building infrastructure. We are simply trying to address the gaps that exist in the legislation that have been leveraged to stymie development. So I appreciate you going through those.
If we don't have enough pipeline capacity now, making it even slower to be able to get more, or to say, let's do hydrogen like we're doing natural gas, is not going to fix this. We're going to then bump our heads on why can't we get hydrogen pipelines in the ground? Why can't we actually get this going? So I do think we need to fix the whole permitting process when we address hydrogen to be able to make sure that we're actually able to get energy done in the process. Mr. Marshall, I do want to ask you about this as well. The timeline you would expect on a hydrogen transition, is this a couple of years or a couple of decades?
It's a couple decades, Senator. It's not overnight.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the goal is that by 2050, when you look at reports, about 20% of world's energy will come from hydrogen. And I think it's fair to say that it can be a linear from where we are today. So it's not an overnight transition.
So if it's for home use or commercial use, not just for fuel cells and such, are we talking about not just changing the pipes
Yeah.
moving that hydrogen, but also changing the pipes in the house, changing the appliances, changing orifice, would all those things have to change as well?
I would say this, Senator, I think the world is different than that. If I was going to design the future for 2050, it would be more things like heat pumps, using electricity. I think old infrastructure will need to be able to be changed. There's lots of work going on in the industry today, especially in Europe, where I'm seeing devices that are able to take, for example, dryers, which run on natural gas, to convert them to hydrogen. So I think the technology will come for that last mile. I would think more about what they're doing in Denmark, where you have over 60 gigawatts of wind power they're looking to put offshore, put a huge hydrogen pipeline dedicated just for transmission, not to homes, but to provide things like fueling for vehicles and other activities. I think that's the right, this is really for B2B to start. It's not B to home, and it'll eventually migrate to B to home as the technology advances.
But you assume at that point that it's repiping or changing from having a gas-powered whatever to be to electric power. So that is a pretty dramatic transition in homes. So we're not talking something soon on the home consumer side. That's a long way off.
Now, Senator, if you look at our business model, it is a B2B business model for the next decade.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all again for taking time out of your busy lives to be with us. I want to start with Mr. Marsh. As we embark on building out our hydrogen economy, we have to make sure that we're building out a low or zero emissions economy. This is going to require standardized methods for evaluating and certifying life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for hydrogen production, hydrogen transportation. There are efforts underway to create such standards, but we are still far from a consensus, as close as I am told. So what is needed to make life cycle analysis standards robust so that we can depend on them and we can build out, and how will they enable the expansion of this national hydrogen infrastructure?
I think that's a real good question, Senator. And it is real, to me, fundamentally, it's a question of what is the CI score, right? It's the lower the carbon index score. It is, pretty straightforward when you're looking from green hydrogen sources, at least when you're not thinking about type 3 type emissions. It's a pretty straightforward calculation. I do think that there is a need for standard bodies to help, especially the DOE, and making sure it's well established. NREL's done some really great modeling, which we all leverage, and that I think is a good framework to direct people, and that's really what we use. But that calculation of CI, when I was in Scotland for COP26, it was the big issue. How do you really count carbon? And to me, that's something that the government can help a great deal of. And NREL has done a wonderful job giving us good models to leverage.
Yeah, as a senator from Colorado, I am always sympathetic to hearing the word NREL. Just makes my heart sing.
I didn't know that, Senator.
Mr. Powers, I think that we've been focused largely on hydrogen pipeline regulations at the federal level. However, the states on those where those pipelines have to traverse, they have their own regulations that need to be taken into account. Are you aware of any pipeline regulations at the state level that conflict with each other, which would make it difficult to establish interstate standards, interstate pipelines?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I haven't actually done a survey of all the states and what their regulations are. I've seen some states like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and so forth that have permitted pipelines like ethane. I've seen in Illinois they permitted a crude oil line. In Texas, they have a statute that says if you want to have eminent domain powers, then you can subject yourself to the common carrier provisions in that state. So I do see in various states that there are differences between the federal agencies at times and the states. And this has especially showed up in oil pipeline construction and oil pipeline routing and so forth. So But I think, let me just pivot and say, for hydrogen, given that it's a new industry and given the states should have a very big interest in developing hydrogen hubs, maybe there's a little bit different dynamic that could apply. But in any event, I think it's important to listen to people to see where they're having problems, because it's not an easy thing to build any kind of infrastructure these days.
Got it. I appreciate that. I think we'll have to all step up there and make sure that we do get to those, a comprehensive way of equilibrating those differences. Mr. Zamarin, is that the right way to pronounce that?
Zamarin, but you're fine. Thank you.
Zamarin, sorry. As we build out our domestic clean hydrogen network, obviously a number of other countries are doing the same thing. We want to ensure that we remain a competitive player on the international market in terms of production and export, import, obviously emission standards, cost. Is there adequate regulation for liquid hydrogen, import, export, to enable the international trade of hydrogen from the U.S. with the rest of the world market? And what would be needed to get to that point?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on export of ammonia, and others may speak to that, but I would say that we do have an incredible advantage here in the U.S. As I spoke about the infrastructure that we have, our ability to produce energy at low cost, transport it over long distances from many different parts of the country and export it. We've proven it with natural gas. I mean, we are the low cost, low emissions producer of natural gas and exporter around the world, the most powerful decarbonization tool the world has today by displacing foreign coal. I believe we can do the same with hydrogen. I don't know, to your specific question, what needs to be addressed in order to ensure that we can export hydrogen effectively. But I will say the natural gas infrastructure that we are building, we are working with each of the LNG export terminals to ensure that they will be ready for the export of ammonia and clean hydrogen in the event that we can scale that up as well. So I do believe that the U.S. can be a leader and can be the most cost-effective supplier for the world.
Great. I appreciate that. I'm out of time. I have a couple more questions that I will submit in writing. Again, appreciate all your time. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Krucka, just start off with a really basic question. I think I read once or was told that when you make hydrogen, the heat content of hydrogen or a hydrogen derivative is only about 1/3 of that of natural gas. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So that's kind of a problem, right? It's going to drive up the expense dramatically, right?
Well, yeah, if you think about what natural gas is made of methane, and you're letting go of that carbon atom and all the energy that comes with combustion of that carbon. So,
And Mr. Marsh, again, just to explore, by the way, I enjoyed our meeting a while ago, and thanks for considering the great state of Louisiana as the ideal place to.
We will be building a plant for you in the great state of Louisiana, Senator, with Owen.
Now, part of that seems to be, though, that I gathered that for green hydrogen, it's like 38 kilograms or 38 liters of water to make one of hydrogen. Now, Louisiana's got more water than we know what to do with most of the time. But nonetheless, that also seems to be kind of a limitation on the production of green hydrogen.
So let me make 2 points. The first point, Senator, is that it's about the same, for a kilogram of hydrogen is about equivalent to 2 gallons of gasoline. And the amount of water required is about equivalent to 1 gallon of gasoline. So it takes about 5 gallons of water to make a gallon of gasoline. Mm-hmm. That being said, what we're doing in California is actually really exciting. We're actually using wastewater, which we're actually cleaning up from the local community and using it in our electrolyzer product. And some of that wastewater is actually going back to the local community to provide water to the area. So I think us in this industry are continue to think through creative ways to leverage water to, and I'm from Philadelphia, that's why I don't say water right, creative ways to leverage water to allow the community to benefit from the activities we're doing.
Mr. Zamarin, you've spoken of the need for regulatory reform, and we've kind of emphasized NEPA, but I think there's a lot of things on the table. Can we actually get to a net carbon neutral economy without significant regulatory reform expanding beyond NEPA?
Thank you, Senator. I believe we can, and as an industry, we're committed to doing so. We are very focused on decarbonizing the existing natural gas value chain. We recognize that methane emissions need to be eliminated. We also recognize the opportunity to further decarbonize the value chain through carbon CO2 sequestration.
Now, can you do that without significant regulatory reform? Because it seems like sometimes you're walking in mud, deep mud, to
Yes.
get things done.
I will say on CO2 sequestration, the updates to 45Q, we fully support. We think that'll be important. We also think that permitting for sequestration, it needs to be streamlined. It is a very slow permitting process, and there's not a lot of staff at the federal level that will, if we want to scale up sequestration, we absolutely do need to streamline.
It does
that
seem like we've
process.
met the enemy, and he is us when it comes to getting that, us, I should say, like EPA. Louisiana asked for primacy in terms of how to do it. I think I was told we had like 32 geologists, and EPA Region 6 had 6, and it took them like almost a year to finally send it to DC EPA.
Yes.
And our primacy, of course, has to obey all their rules. Let me ask you, in the infrastructure bill, which I worked on with my colleagues, there's a lot in there to help transition a state like Louisiana, which is very carbon intense, into one which is kind of a 2050 economy. Speak of your company. You started to speak of your company's kind of effort along those lines. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. Louisiana is a great example. I mean, it is a really important state for us and for our country. We are one of the largest gatherers of natural gas in the Haynesville, which is one of the lowest emissions basins in the world. We can produce natural gas in the Haynesville Basin, Louisiana, with incredibly low emissions. We are gathering that. We have just announced a pipeline to bring that to the coast for LNG exports, to increase LNG exports to our friends and allies around the world. And we are working to develop a CCUS project alongside that will decarbonize that project. We do need help in streamlining the permitting process.
Now,
and
that
would-
should be intrastate. So are you still, so is it the CCUS as
The
opposed to?
sequestration will require permitting in Louisiana, but it is intrastate.
And so you're okay on the pipeline, but it's.
Well, it delivers into interstate pipelines as well. So to get the LNG capacity built, I mean, it is such an interconnected network that we operate in the United States. We can build, an intrastate pipeline, but we're going to hit a need to expand the interstate system in order to get it to the LNG terminals that we need to expand. So they are all codependent across the value chain.
One more thing, because Manchin and Barrasso explored, and you said quite dramatically that you used to calculate $1 million per mile of pipeline, and now it's $22 million. For that, can you give us the cost basis of the intrastate portion of that pipeline as opposed to the interstate?
I can follow up with you on that, sir, but it is significantly cheaper to.
I want to make sure that our values are still, we have an apples and apples now versus now and before.
Yes.
But we'll get that. Thank you. I yield.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.